The laugh cut through the marble lobby like a knife through silk. Victor Matthews threw his head back, his $1,000 tie swinging against his chest, his mouth wide open in mockery. The sound bounced off the 30-foot ceilings of First Continental Bank, past the digital stock tickers scrolling green and red numbers, past the businessmen in their pressed suits who paused mid-conversation to look. They were all looking at her. Margaret Hayes stood at the counter, 75 years old, wearing a simple navy blue dress that cost less than Victor's cufflinks. Her silver hair was pinned back with quiet elegance. Pearl earrings, real ones but small, caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. She held a worn envelope in her hands, the edges soft from years of handling. "I just want to check my balance," she said to the young banker behind the mahogany counter. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind of steady that comes from decades of teaching children to read, from burying a husband, from raising a granddaughter alone. Victor's laugh grew louder. Balance. He didn't bother lowering his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. What could a woman like her possibly have in a bank account? Probably checking if her Social Security check cleared. The men around him chuckled. Nervous laughs. The kind people give when the most powerful man in the room makes a joke, funny or not. Margaret's granddaughter, Lily, stood 3 feet behind her. 28 years old. Sharpsuit. Corporate law firm name tag still clipped to her jacket from the meeting she'd left early. Her jaw tightened. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Grandma, we can go to another branch." "No." Margaret didn't turn around. "We're here. This is the bank." The young banker, his nameplate read Tyler, glanced nervously toward Victor's corner of the lobby. Everyone knew Victor Matthews. Hedge fund manager. Net worth somewhere north of $300 million. The kind of client who had a private office upstairs, who got champagne when he walked in, who could make a young banker's career vanish with a single phone call. Tyler swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I can certainly help you check your balance. Do you have your account number?" Margaret reached into her envelope and pulled out a small card. Yellow with H. Numbers handwritten in blue ink that had faded over the decades. Victor pushed himself up from the leather chair in the corner. He straightened his navy suit jacket, Italian cut, custom tailored, and walked toward the counter. His shoes clicked against the polished floor. Every step deliberate. Every step designed to announce his presence. "This should be good," he muttered to his colleague, a younger man named Preston who followed him like a shadow. "Let's see what the widow has been saving. $50? Maybe 100 if she's been frugal?" Lily stepped forward. "Excuse me, do you have a problem?" Victor looked at her like she was furniture that had suddenly spoken. His eyes traveled from her shoes to her face, and he smiled. The kind of smile that made people feel small. "No problem at all, sweetheart. Just enjoying the show. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter." Margaret turned her head slightly. Not all the way. Just enough to catch Victor in her peripheral vision. She studied him for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to Tyler. "The account, please." Tyler typed in the numbers. His fingers moved slowly, carefully, the way people move when they're being watched by someone important. The screen loaded. Tyler's eyebrows pulled together. He blinked. Typed the numbers again. The screen loaded a second time. Tyler's face went white. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I'm going to need to get my supervisor." Victor laughed again. "See? Probably overdrawn. Happens to these people all the time." But Tyler wasn't laughing. Tyler was staring at his screen like he'd just seen something impossible. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone. "Mr. Morrison? Sir, I need you at counter 7. Immediately. Sir, right now." Lily moved closer to her grandmother. "Grandma, what's going on? Is everything okay?" Margaret said nothing. She simply waited, her hands folded over her worn envelope, her expression unchanged. Whatever was on that screen, she already knew. She had known for 43 years. The elevator doors opened at the far end of the lobby. David Morrison, senior financial advisor, stepped out. 52 years old. Gray at the temples. The kind of man who had seen everything in 30 years of banking. He walked toward counter 7. Victor watched him approach, still smirking, still certain this was all a joke. Still certain that a woman in a simple navy dress couldn't possibly have anything worth a supervisor's time. David Morrison reached the counter. He looked at the screen. He looked at Margaret. He looked back at the screen. And then he did something that made Victor Matthews stop laughing. He bowed his head slightly. A gesture of respect. "Mrs. Hayes," David said quietly, "it's an honor. Please, if you'll follow me to my private office." Victor's smirk faltered. "What's going on? Morrison, what's happening?" David Morrison turned to face Victor. There was something in his eyes. Something that looked almost like contempt. "Mr. Matthews," he said, "I think you should see this." He turned the screen toward the lobby. The number glowed in green against the black background. $25 million. And in that moment, the marble lobby of First Continental Bank went completely, absolutely silent. Victor Matthews stared at the screen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Margaret Hayes picked up her worn envelope, tucked it back into her purse, and turned to face the man who had been laughing at her. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen war's end, had watched a husband receive medals for valor, had graded 10,000 homework papers, had buried the love of her life and kept his secret for 4 decades. "I believe," she said softly, "you were saying something about my balance?" Victor's face had turned the color of old ash. His hands hung limp at his sides. But Margaret Hayes wasn't finished. She took one step toward him. Just one. Close enough that he could see the lines around her eyes. Close enough that he could smell the faint lavender of her perfume. "My husband," she said, "taught me something a long time ago. He said that true wealth has nothing to do with numbers on a screen. It has to do with how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you." She paused. "You failed that test today, Mr. Matthews." Then she turned and walked toward the elevator, her granddaughter following in stunned silence. David Morrison fell into step beside them, leaving Victor Matthews standing alone in the middle of the lobby he had once owned. The elevator doors opened. Margaret stepped inside. And just before the doors closed, she looked back at Victor one final time. "If you want to know how a schoolteacher ended up with $25 million, she said, "you're welcome to join us upstairs. But I warn you, the story might teach you something about yourself that you're not ready to learn." The doors slid shut. Victor stood there, his chest heaving, his reputation cracked open like an egg on marble. He had 2 choices now. Walk away and pretend this never happened. Or follow her upstairs and find out how a woman he had dismissed as nothing had become worth more than most people would ever dream. Victor Matthews straightened his tie. He walked toward the elevator. Because Victor Matthews never walked away from a challenge. And he had no idea that walking into that elevator would change everything he thought he knew about money, power, and the price of arrogance. The elevator doors opened, and Victor stepped out onto the executive floor. Thick carpet silenced his footsteps. Mahogany doors lined the hallway. Oil paintings of the bank's founders stared down from gilded frames. This was the floor where real money lived. The floor where decisions were made that moved markets. Victor had been here 100 times. He knew every corner, every office, every assistant's name. But today, walking behind Margaret Hayes and her granddaughter, he felt like a stranger in his own kingdom. David Morrison led them to his corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Persian rug. A conference table sat near the window, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. "Please," David said, gesturing to the chairs. "Make yourselves comfortable." Margaret walked to the window instead. She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the skyline, at the buildings that scraped the clouds, at the streets below where people rushed through their lives without knowing what was happening 6 floors above them. Lily sat down, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Her mind was still spinning. $25 million. Her grandmother. The woman who reused tea bags, who made soup from vegetable scraps, who had driven the same Honda Civic for 12 years. "Grandma," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand." Margaret didn't turn from the window. I know you don't, sweetheart. That's why we're here. Victor remained standing near the door. He had regained some of his composure during the elevator ride. The color had returned to his face. His jaw was set in its usual hard line. I want an explanation, he said. That kind of money doesn't just appear in a schoolteacher's account. There's always a story. Inheritance. Lawsuit settlement. Something. David Morrison sat behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him. Mr. Matthews, perhaps you should let Mrs. Hayes speak. I'll speak when I have answers. You'll have them. Margaret's voice was calm, almost gentle. But first, Mr. Matthews, I'd like you to answer a question for me. Victor's eyebrows rose. Excuse me? Margaret turned from the window. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. When you saw me walk into this bank today, she said, what did you see? Victor hesitated. It was a trap. He knew it was a trap. But his pride wouldn't let him stay silent. I saw an old woman in a cheap dress, holding an envelope like it was her lifeline. I saw someone who didn't belong in this bank. Someone who had nothing, Margaret finished for him. Someone small. Someone easy to dismiss. Victor said nothing. My husband saw the same thing once. Margaret walked to the conference table and sat down across from Lily. He was 19 years old, standing in a rice paddy in Vietnam, surrounded by men twice his age. They looked at him and saw a kid from Ohio who didn't belong there. Someone who would break under pressure. Someone who would run when the bullets started flying. She folded her hands on the table. They were wrong about him. Just like you were wrong about me. David Morrison leaned forward slightly. There was something in his eyes now. Recognition. Understanding. Mrs. Hayes, he said, your husband was Thomas Hayes. Sergeant Thomas Hayes. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. You know the name. Everyone who served knows the name. David's voice had changed. Softer now. Reverent. He saved 17 men during the Tet Offensive. Carried them out of an ambush one by one while taking fire from 3 directions. They gave him the Bronze Star. The Purple Heart. They offered him the Medal of Honor, but he turned it down. Victor frowned. Turned it down? Why would anyone turn down the Medal of Honor? Because he said he wasn't a hero. Margaret's eyes grew distant, looking at something none of them could see. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. The ones whose names got carved into black granite walls. He said wearing that medal would feel like stealing glory from men who deserved it more. Lily's hand found her grandmother's. Squeezed tight. Thomas came home in 1968, Margaret continued. He got a job at the auto plant. We got married in my mother's backyard. We had a daughter, Lily's mother, and we lived in a 2-bedroom house on Maple Street that cost us $9,000. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. We never had much. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. What they didn't know was that Thomas had a gift. A gift for numbers. For patterns. For seeing things in the stock market that other people missed. Victor's eyes narrowed. He was trading? A factory worker was trading stocks in the 70s. Every paycheck, Margaret said. He'd take 10% and put it into the market. Companies he believed in. Companies that made things, built things, helped people. He never touched the money. Never took a profit. Just let it grow. Year after year. Decade after decade. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather notebook. The cover was cracked. The pages were yellowed. Numbers filled every line, written in neat, careful handwriting. This is his ledger. Every investment he ever made. Every stock he ever bought. Every decision, documented right here. David Morrison looked at the notebook like it was a holy relic. 43 years of compound growth. In the right companies. At the right times. Thomas died in 2011, Margaret said. Cancer. By the time he passed, the account was worth $18 million. I haven't touched it since except to let it keep growing. The way he would have wanted. The room went quiet. Victor stood near the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his mind racing. 18 million grown to 25 million in 13 years. Passive growth. No intervention. Just the slow, patient accumulation of wealth by a dead man's final strategy. It was brilliant, and it made Victor feel something he hadn't felt in years. "Well, why didn't you spend any of it?" Lily asked. Her voice cracked. "Grandma, you've been living like we were barely getting by. You could have had anything. A bigger house. A nicer car. Help with the bills." Margaret took her granddaughter's face in her hands. Gently. The way she had when Lily was 5 years old and crying over a scraped knee. "Because, sweetheart, that money was never for me." Lily blinked. "What do you mean?" Margaret released her granddaughter's face and turned to look at Victor. Then at David. Then back at Lily. "Thomas made me promise something before he died. He made me promise that his money would go to the one thing he cared about more than anything else in the world." She stood up and walked back to the window. The men he served with. The men who didn't come home. The men whose families never got to say goodbye. She turned around. "I'm going to build a memorial. A place where veterans can come to remember their brothers. A place where families can find peace. A place where Thomas's legacy can live on forever." The afternoon sun was beginning to set behind the skyline, casting golden light across Margaret's face. $25 million, she said. "Every penny. That's what it's going to cost to build something worthy of their sacrifice." David Morrison stood up from his desk. There were tears in his eyes. Victor Matthews stood frozen by the door. And Lily Hayes sat at the conference table, looking at her grandmother like she was seeing her for the very first time. But the silence didn't last. Because Victor Matthews hadn't built his fortune by staying quiet. And what he said next would change everything. A memorial. His voice was flat. "Colt, you're going to spend $25 million on a memorial." Margaret met his gaze. "Yes." Victor shook his head slowly. A smile crept across his face. But it wasn't a kind smile. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I think we need to have a conversation about what you're really going to do with that money." The golden light from the window faded as clouds rolled across the sun. Victor Matthews stepped away from the door and walked toward the conference table. His shoes were silent on the thick carpet. His shadow stretched long across the floor. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "You have $25 million. $25 million. And you want to spend it on a building. A building for dead soldiers." "A memorial," Margaret corrected. "For fallen heroes." "Same thing." Victor pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, making himself comfortable. "Mrs. Hayes, I've been in finance for 22 years. I've seen people with money make a lot of stupid decisions. But this might be the stupidest one I've ever heard." Lily's hands curled into fists on the table. "You don't get to talk to her like that." "I'm not talking to her like anything. I'm telling her the truth." Victor's eyes never left Margaret. $25 million invested properly could generate returns of $2 million a year. Minimum. That's money that could change your family's life forever. Money that could set up your granddaughter. Money that could fund scholarships, hospitals, research centers. Real things. Things that matter. You don't think honoring fallen soldiers matters? Victor waved his hand dismissively. There are already memorials. The wall in Washington. The one in every small town across America. What's one more going to do? Give people another place to cry and leave flowers that die in a week. David Morrison spoke from behind his desk. "Mr. Matthews, I think you're out of line. I think I'm the only one in this room being honest." Victor leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Look, Mrs. Hayes. I get it. Your husband was a hero. He saved lives. He deserves to be remembered. But there are smarter ways to honor him than throwing $25 million at a construction project that's going to take 5 years to build and cost twice what you're budgeting." Margaret listened. Her face gave nothing away. "What would you suggest instead, Mr. Matthews?" Victor's eyes lit up. This was his territory now. This was where he lived. Endowment funds. Scholarships in his name at every major university in Ohio. A foundation that supports veterans' mental health. Things that keep giving year after year, generation after generation. Things that grow instead of sitting there collecting bird droppings. He spread his hands wide. Let me help you. I know people. I know how to structure these things. We could set up a foundation, put the money to work, and in 10 years, it could be worth 50 million. 100 million. You could help thousands of veterans instead of just building a statue that people walk past without looking. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Lily watched her grandmother's face, trying to read what was happening behind those calm gray eyes. Part of her wanted to scream at Victor to leave. Another part wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had a point. Mr. Matthews, Margaret finally said, what do you get out of this? Victor blinked. Excuse me? You're offering to help me manage $25 million. You're offering to set up foundations and endowments. You're offering your expertise, your connections, your knowledge. Margaret tilted her head slightly. What's your fee? Victor's smile tightened just a fraction. We can discuss terms later. The important thing right now is that you answer my question. Margaret's voice hadn't risen, but something in it had hardened. You've spent the last hour insulting me, mocking me, and treating my husband's legacy like a business opportunity. So I'll ask again. What do you get out of this? The room went quiet. David Morrison was watching Victor now with new eyes. Lily was holding her breath. Victor sat back in his chair. The charm was gone from his face. What remained was calculation. Pure, cold calculation. Standard management fees, he said. 1% annually. That's $250,000 a year. Plus performance bonuses if the fund exceeds certain benchmarks. $250,000 a year, Margaret repeated. To manage my husband's money. It's industry standard. It's $250,000 that won't go to veterans. Victor's jaw tightened. Mrs. Hayes, you clearly don't understand how this works. I understand perfectly, Mr. Matthews. Margaret stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the city again. I've been watching men like you my whole life. Men who see money as a game. Men who count their worth in zeros and forget that behind every dollar, there's a human being who earned it. She turned around. My husband crawled through mud and blood to save 17 men. He woke up screaming for 30 years because of what he saw. He worked a factory job for 40 years so that our daughter could go to college. And when he died, he asked me for one thing. One single thing. Her voice cracked slightly. Just for a moment. Then the steel came back. He asked me to build something beautiful. Something that would stand for 100 years. Something that would make people stop and remember that freedom isn't free. That the price of the life we live was paid by men who never got to live theirs. She walked toward Victor. Stopped 3 feet away from his chair. You want to know what you can do with your 1% fee, Mr. Matthews? Victor said nothing. You can take it and leave this room. Because my husband's money will never make you a single dime. Victor stood up slowly. He was taller than Margaret by almost a foot. Younger by decades. Richer by hundreds of millions. But in that moment, standing in front of her, he felt none of those advantages. You're making a mistake, he said. His voice was quiet now. Dangerous. I'm trying to help you. No. Margaret shook her head. You're trying to help yourself. There's a difference. And my husband taught me to recognize it a long time ago. Victor's hands curled into fists at his sides. Then he smiled. A cold, sharp smile that didn't reach his eyes. Fine, he said. Build your memorial. Spend every penny on concrete and bronze and pretty landscaping. But mark my words, Mrs. Hayes, projects like this don't go smoothly. Construction delays. Budget overruns. City permits. Zoning issues. 100 things can go wrong. He walked toward the door. And when they do, when you're out of money and out of options, you'll wish you had taken my offer. He opened the door. I'll be watching, Mrs. Hayes. Very closely. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. David Morrison came around his desk and put a hand on Margaret's shoulder. Mrs. Hayes, that was... I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He's not going to let this go, she said quietly. Men like him never do. Lily moved to her grandmother's side. Grandma, what did he mean? What things could go wrong? Margaret looked at her granddaughter. Looked at David. Looked out the window at the city where her husband had dreamed of building something that would last forever. I don't know, sweetheart, she said. But I have a feeling we're about to find out. 3 floors below, Victor Matthews stepped out of the elevator and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number from memory. It's me, he said when the line connected. I need information on a construction project. A veterans memorial. Find out who's involved, what permits are needed, and who owes me favors at City Hall. He walked toward the exit. And do it fast. Because I'm about to teach an old woman a very expensive lesson. The morning sun cut through the blinds of Margaret's kitchen like knives of gold. She sat at the small wooden table where she had eaten 10,000 breakfasts. The same table where Thomas had spread out his newspapers and circled stock prices with a red pen. The same table where she had graded homework until midnight, year after year, decade after decade. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lily. Meeting at the bank in 2 hours. David found an architect. This is really happening, Grandma. This is really happening. Margaret set the phone down and looked at the photograph on the wall. Thomas, young and strong, standing in front of their first house with a paintbrush in his hand and white paint splattered on his cheek. He was laughing. He was always laughing back then, before the nightmares came, before the cancer, before he left her alone with $25 million and a promise she was still fighting to keep. I hope I'm doing this right, she whispered to the photograph. I hope you can see what I'm trying to build. The photograph didn't answer. It never did. But Margaret could still hear Thomas's voice in her memory, the way he used to talk late at night when the dreams woke him up and he couldn't go back to sleep. Build something beautiful, Maggie. Something that lasts. Something that tells the world we were here. The doorbell rang. Margaret frowned. Lily wasn't supposed to pick her up for another 2 hours. She pushed herself up from the table, her joints protesting the way they always did these days, and walked to the front door. She opened it. Victor Matthews stood on her porch. He was wearing a different suit today. Charcoal gray. No tie. His hands were in his pockets, and there was something in his posture that Margaret didn't recognize. Something that almost looked like uncertainty. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now. Margaret said nothing. She waited. Victor shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Can I come in? Just for 5 minutes. I want to tell you something. Every instinct told Margaret to close the door. Every memory of his laughing face in the bank lobby, his cold threats in David's office, his calculating eyes measuring her husband's money like it was already his. But there was something else in his face now. Something she hadn't seen before. 5 minutes, she said and stepped aside. Victor walked into the small house and stopped in the living room. His eyes moved across the space, the worn carpet, the old television, the shelves filled with books and photographs and 50 years of memories. He looked like a man who had walked into a foreign country and didn't speak the language. This is where you live, he said. It wasn't a question. This is where I've lived for 47 years. Victor turned to face her. You could have bought a mansion. A penthouse. Anything you wanted. I have everything I want, Mr. Matthews. I always did. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, but it was different from the laugh in the bank. Softer. Almost sad. My mother used to say things like that. She used to say money doesn't buy happiness. That the best things in life are free. He walked to the window and looked out at the small yard, the modest cars parked on the street, the ordinary neighborhood where Margaret Hayes had built her ordinary life. I always thought she was just saying that because we didn't have money. Because she didn't know what it felt like to have everything you ever wanted. He turned around. But you do know, don't you? You've had $25 million sitting in a bank account for over a decade. And you chose to live like this anyway. Margaret sat down in her favorite chair. The one Thomas used to call her throne. Is that what you came here to say, Mr. Matthews? That you're surprised I'm not greedy? No. Victor's voice was strange now. Heavy. I came here to warn you. Margaret's eyes sharpened. Warn me about what? Victor pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He walked across the room and handed it to her. Margaret unfolded it. It was a printout of an email. Names, dates, dollar amounts. City council members. Zoning board officials. A construction company called Meridian Development. I did some digging after I left the bank yesterday, Victor said. I wanted to find out what permits you'd need, what obstacles you'd face. He stopped himself. I wanted to find a way to slow you down. To make you come back to me for help. Margaret looked up from the paper. And what did you find? Someone already beat me to it. The words hung in the air. Meridian Development, Victor continued. They're the biggest construction company in the state. They've been buying up land around the site you're looking at for your memorial. 3 parcels in the last 6 months. And they've got friends on the zoning board who are about to make your project very, very difficult. Margaret's hands tightened on the paper. Why would a construction company care about a veteran's memorial? Because the land you want is worth 3 times what you're offering. And Meridian wants to build a luxury hotel complex there instead. Your memorial would block their access to the waterfront. Margaret looked at the names on the paper. Politicians she didn't know. Businessmen she had never heard of. A web of connections that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Yesterday you threatened me. You said you'd be watching. You said I'd come crawling back. Victor sat down on the couch across from her. He looked tired. Older than he had in the bank. Because I spent last night reading about your husband. Margaret went very still. Sergeant Thomas Hayes, Victor said. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Saved 17 men during an ambush that killed 43 others. Refused the Medal of Honor because he said he didn't deserve it. Victor's voice cracked slightly. My father served too. Marines. 2 tours in Vietnam. He never talked about it. Never told us what he saw. He drank himself to death by the time I was 15. Please subscribe to True Guardian Tales and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Margaret said nothing. She waited. I didn't grow up with money, Mrs. Hayes. I grew up with nothing. My mother worked 2 jobs. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment until I was 12. I clawed my way into business school on scholarships and part-time jobs. Everything I have, I built myself. And somewhere along the way... He stopped. Swallowed. Somewhere along the way, I forgot why I was building it. He looked at Margaret with eyes that held something she hadn't expected. Your husband saved 17 men, Victor said. My father couldn't even save himself. And I've spent 20 years trying to fill that hole with money, with power, with... He shook his head. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I understand now why you want to build this memorial. And I understand that there are people who are going to try to stop you. Margaret looked at the paper in her hands. Then back at Victor. Why should I trust you, Mr. Matthews? After everything you said? Everything you did? Victor stood up. He walked to the door. Put his hand on the handle. You shouldn't, he said. I haven't given you any reason to trust me. But I've given you information. What you do with it is your choice. He opened the door. I'll be at the zoning board meeting next week. Watching. And if you need help, if things go sideways, you'll have my number. He stepped onto the porch. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mrs. Hayes. I'm just asking for a chance to be the kind of man my father never got to see me become. The door closed behind him. Margaret sat alone in her living room, holding a paper full of names and numbers and schemes, wondering if Victor Matthews was playing another game or if something real had just happened in her small house on the quiet street. Either way, one thing was certain. The battle for Thomas's memorial had just begun. And the enemies were already gathering. The zoning board meeting room smelled like old coffee and desperation. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the 50 people packed into folding chairs. City officials sat behind a long table at the front, shuffling papers and checking their phones. A clock on the wall showed 6:47 p.m. The meeting was supposed to start at 6:30. Margaret Hayes sat in the 3rd row, her hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on the empty podium where, in a few minutes, she would have to fight for her husband's dream. Lily sat beside her, legal pad ready, jaw tight. David Morrison was on her other side, wearing his Army veteran pin on his lapel-like armor. Behind them, scattered throughout the room, were people Margaret didn't recognize. Men in expensive suits. Women with tablets and earpieces. The Meridian Development team, here to watch the old widow lose. And in the back corner, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, was Victor Matthews. Margaret had seen him when she walked in. Their eyes had met for just a moment. He hadn't smiled, hadn't nodded, hadn't given any sign of what he was thinking. He was just there. Watching. Like he had promised. The chairman of the zoning board, a heavy-set man named Bernard Crane, finally cleared his throat and tapped his microphone. All right, let's get started. First item on the agenda, Application ZB 2024-1847, proposed construction of a Veterans Memorial Park on Parcel 117B, Riverside Drive. He peered over his glasses at the room. Applicant is a Margaret Hayes. Mrs. Hayes, please approach the podium. Margaret stood. Her knees protested. Her heart was pounding faster than it had in years. 50 years of teaching had prepared her to speak in front of crowds, but those crowds had been children. These were wolves. She walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone, looked out at the room full of strangers who held her husband's dream in their hands. Good evening, she said. Her voice was steady. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am here to request approval for the construction of the Thomas Hayes Memorial Park, honoring the veterans who served and sacrificed for our country. She opened a folder and pulled out a rendering. An architect's vision. Green spaces and walking paths. A wall of names carved in black granite. A bronze sculpture of a soldier kneeling, one hand reaching toward the sky. This memorial will sit on 3 acres of land overlooking the riverside. It will be open to the public 365 days a year. It will be funded entirely by private donation, with no cost to taxpayers. And it will give families, veterans, and the community a place to remember those who gave everything. She looked at the board members. One by one. I am asking for your approval tonight. Not for myself, but for the men whose names will be carved into that wall. Men who will never come home. Men who deserve to be remembered. She stepped back from the podium. Bernard Crane shuffled his papers. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. Are there any objections or comments from the public? A man in the 4th row stood up immediately. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Margaret's car. He walked to the second microphone. Franklin Tate, representing Meridian Development. His voice was smooth as silk and twice as slippery. We have concerns about this application. Margaret's stomach tightened. Parcel 117B is adjacent to 3 parcels currently owned by Meridian Development, Tate continued. A memorial park at this location would create traffic congestion, reduce property values, and interfere with planned development that will bring 500 jobs and $30 million in tax revenue to this city. He paused. Let the numbers sink in. We ask the board to consider whether a memorial, however well-intentioned, is the best use of this prime waterfront real estate. We suggest the applicant explore alternative locations that would better serve the community's interests. He sat down. Whispers rippled through the room. Margaret saw the board members exchanging glances. She saw Bernard Crane's face shift, almost imperceptibly, toward concern. She had been outmaneuvered before she even started. Mrs. Hayes, Crane said, do you have a response? Margaret walked back to the podium. Her mind was racing. Victor's warning echoed in her ears. They've got friends on the zoning board. The land I've chosen, she said, was specifically selected because it overlooks the water. Many of the soldiers who died in Vietnam were shipped home across the ocean. The memorial's position is not an accident. It's a tribute. With respect, Franklin Tate said from his seat, sentimentality doesn't pay taxes. A few people in the room laughed. Low, ugly laughs. Margaret felt her face flush. She opened her mouth to respond, and then a voice cut through the room from the back. I'd like to speak. Everyone turned. Victor Matthews pushed himself off the wall and walked down the center aisle. His shoes clicked against the linoleum. His eyes were fixed on the board. "Mr. Matthews," Bernard Crane said, surprise evident in his voice. "This is unexpected. Do you have standing in this matter?" "I have financial standing." Victor reached the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. "As of this morning, I am a co-sponsor of the Thomas Hayes Memorial Project. I've pledged $5 million of my personal funds to ensure its completion." The room went silent. Margaret stared at Victor. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Lily grabbed her grandmother's arm. "Grandma, did you know about this?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No." Victor turned to face the board. "I know what some of you are thinking. Victor Matthews doesn't do charity. Victor Matthews doesn't get involved in projects that don't make him money. And you'd be right. That's who I was." He paused. "But I spent some time recently learning about a man named Thomas Hayes. A man who saved 17 lives in Vietnam. A man who came home and worked 40 years in a factory. A man who quietly invested his earnings and never told a soul because he wanted to build something that would outlast him." Victor's voice changed. Rougher now. More real. "My father served in Vietnam too. He never talked about it. He never got help. He never found peace. And he died thinking he was worthless." He looked directly at Franklin Tate. "This memorial isn't just about property values and tax revenue. It's about telling every veteran in this country that they matter, that their sacrifice matters, that we see them." He turned back to the board. "I'm not asking you to approve this because of me. I'm asking you to approve this because it's the right thing to do. And because Meridian Development's alternative, another luxury hotel on a waterfront we're supposed to share, isn't serving the community. It's serving their shareholders." Franklin Tate stood up. "Mr. Matthews, this is highly irregular. Your sudden involvement is perfectly legal," Victor cut him off. "I've already filed the paperwork. $5 million in an irrevocable trust dedicated to this project. You can verify it with my attorneys." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a document, walked forward and placed it on the board's table. "The question now," Victor said, "is whether this board wants to be remembered as the people who blocked a veterans memorial to build another hotel, or as the people who had the courage to do what's right." Bernard Crane picked up the document, read it, passed it to the member beside him. The room held its breath. Margaret stood at the podium, watching Victor Matthews, the man who had laughed at her, threatened her, tried to control her, put everything on the line for her husband's dream. She didn't understand why. She wasn't sure she trusted it. But in that moment, standing in a fluorescent-lit room full of wolves, she had an ally. And that was more than she'd had when she walked in. Bernard Crane cleared his throat. "The board will take a 15-minute recess to review this new information. All parties please remain in the building." He banged his gavel. The room erupted in whispers. Margaret walked to where Victor was standing. She looked up at him, this tall, complicated man who had become someone she didn't recognize. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do this?" Victor looked down at her. And for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't smile. He didn't posture. He didn't perform. "Because your husband saved 17 men," he said quietly. "And I couldn't save one." He turned and walked toward the exit. "I'll be outside. Whatever the board decides, I meant what I said. Every word." The door closed behind him. Margaret stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by whispers and stares and the weight of everything that had just changed. Lily appeared at her side. "Grandma, what just happened?" Margaret looked at the door Victor had walked through. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said. "But I think the real battle is just beginning." And somewhere in the back of the room, Franklin Tate pulled out his phone and typed a single message. "He's betrayed us. Move to Plan B." The screen glowed. The reply came in seconds. "Already done. What do you think Plan B is? Drop your theory in the comments. And if this story has grabbed your heart, make sure you stay for what comes next. Because the fight for Thomas Hayes's legacy is about to take a turn that nobody, not Margaret, not Victor, not even Meridian Development, saw coming. The bulldozer arrived at dawn. Margaret heard it before she saw it, the deep growl of diesel engines cutting through the quiet morning air on Riverside Drive. She had come to the site early, the way she had every day for the past 3 weeks since the zoning board approved her permit. She came to watch the sun rise over the water, to imagine her husband's memorial rising from the earth, to whisper promises to a man who could no longer hear them. But this morning, the sunrise was blocked by yellow metal and churning treads. 3 bulldozers. 2 dump trucks. A crane that stretched toward the sky like a steel skeleton. And a banner hanging from a chain-link fence that hadn't been there yesterday. Property of Meridian Development. No trespassing. Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered on the ground. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She ran toward the fence, or as close to running as her 75-year-old legs could manage. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. A security guard stepped into her path. Young, thick-necked, wearing a uniform with the Meridian logo on his chest. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is private property." "Private property?" Margaret's voice cracked. "I own this land. I have the deed. I have the permits." The guard shook his head. "Not anymore, you don't." Margaret stared at him. The world tilted sideways. "What are you talking about?" A voice came from behind her. Smooth, confident, dripping with victory. "What he's talking about, Mrs. Hayes, is that your land has been seized through eminent domain." Margaret turned. Franklin Tate walked toward her across the gravel lot, his silver hair perfect, his smile sharp as broken glass. 2 lawyers flanked him, carrying folders thick with documents. "The city council held an emergency session last night," Tate continued. "They determined that this parcel is essential for a public infrastructure project, a new water treatment facility, to be specific. Your memorial park has been deemed non-essential. The land reverts to the city, which has already contracted with Meridian Development to begin construction." Margaret couldn't breathe. "You can't do this," she said. "The zoning board approved my permit. I have $5 million in backing. You can't just—" "We can." Tate's smile widened. "And we did. You have 30 days to remove any personal property from the site. After that, it becomes a construction zone." He held out a folder. "Your copy of the seizure notice. I suggest you have your lawyer review it, though I doubt you'll find any grounds for appeal. We've been very thorough." Margaret took the folder. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The bulldozers roared behind her. Workers in hard hats began unloading equipment. The banner flapped in the morning breeze. Thomas's land. Thomas's dream. Gone in a single night. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why are you doing this? It's just a memorial. It's just a place for people to remember." Franklin Tate leaned in close. Close enough that Margaret could smell his cologne. Close enough that she could see the coldness in his eyes. "Because, Mrs. Hayes, nobody tells Meridian Development no. Nobody embarrasses us in front of a zoning board. And nobody," his voice dropped to a hiss, "brings Victor Matthews into a fight against us." He straightened up. "This isn't about your memorial anymore. This is about sending a message. And you're going to deliver it." He turned and walked away, his lawyers following like shadows. Margaret stood alone in the middle of the gravel lot, surrounded by machines that were about to tear her husband's dream out of the earth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. A text from Lily. "Grandma, turn on the news. Now." Margaret looked up at the bulldozers, at the banner, at the workers who wouldn't meet her eyes. Whatever was on the news, it couldn't be worse than this. She was wrong. She got in her car and drove home in a daze. The streets blurred past her. The radio played songs she didn't hear. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Lily's car was already there, parked at an angle like she had arrived in a panic. Margaret walked through the front door. Lily was standing in the living room, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the television. On the screen, a news anchor was speaking in the grave tone reserved for scandals and disasters. Allegations of financial fraud involving the Thomas Hayes Memorial Fund. Sources say that Victor Matthews, the hedge fund manager who pledged $5 million to the project, may have used the donation as a cover for a money laundering scheme. Margaret's knees buckled. Lily caught her before she hit the floor. "It's not true," Lily said, her voice fierce. "Grandma, it's not true. This is Meridian. They're planting stories. They're trying to destroy everything." But the news anchor kept talking. "City officials have frozen all funds associated with the memorial pending investigation. Mrs. Margaret Hayes, the widow behind the project, was unavailable for comment." Margaret looked at the television, at the photograph of Victor Matthews that filled the screen, at the words "fraud investigation" scrolling across the bottom. 24 hours ago, she had an ally, a permit, and $25 million. Now she had nothing but a folder full of seizure notices and a reputation being shredded on live television. Franklin Tate's words echoed in her mind. This is about sending a message. Margaret closed her eyes. Thomas, she thought. What do I do now? But Thomas couldn't answer, and the bulldozers were already rolling. The phone rang 17 times in an hour. Reporters, lawyers, city officials demanding statements Margaret didn't have. She stopped answering after the 5th call. Lily took over, her corporate law training kicking in, her voice sharp and professional as she deflected questions and demanded to speak with supervisors. David Morrison arrived at noon, still wearing his veteran's pin, his face drawn with worry. "I've been trying to reach Victor all morning," he said. "His phone goes straight to voicemail. His office says he's unavailable." Margaret sat in her chair by the window, staring at nothing. She hadn't moved in 2 hours. Hadn't eaten. Hadn't cried. The shock was still too fresh for tears. "Maybe he ran," Lily said bitterly. "Maybe this was all part of his game. Get close to us, make himself look like a hero, then disappear when it all falls apart." "No." David shook his head. "I've seen con men before. Victor wasn't running a con. He meant what he said at that zoning meeting." "Then where is he?" Nobody had an answer. The afternoon dragged on. More calls. More news updates. The story was spreading social media, cable news, talk radio. Everyone had an opinion about the widow and the millionaire and the memorial that was never going to be built. At 4:47 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Lily opened it. Victor Matthews stood on the porch. He looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was wrinkled. His tie was loose. There was a cut above his left eye, fresh, barely scabbed over. "Can I come in?" His voice was hoarse. Lily blocked the doorway. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here." "Lily." Margaret's voice came from inside the house. Quiet but firm. "Let him in." Lily hesitated. Then she stepped aside. Victor walked into the living room. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're about to deliver news that will change everything. "I know who's behind this," he said. "And I know how to stop them." David stepped forward. "Where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." Victor touched the cut above his eye. "I was having a conversation with some of Franklin Tate's associates. They wanted to convince me to withdraw my support from the memorial. I declined their offer." Margaret studied his face. The exhaustion. The resolve that burned underneath it all. "Sit down, Mr. Matthews," she said. "Tell us everything." Victor sat on the couch. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Meridian Development isn't just a construction company," he began. "They're a front. A way for certain powerful people to move money around without anyone asking questions. The luxury hotel they wanted to build on your land? It was never about hotel rooms. It was about creating a legitimate business to hide illegitimate cash." Lily frowned. "Money laundering? On a massive scale. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through fake construction projects, inflated contracts, shell companies in 3 different states." Victor's jaw tightened. "And when I pledged my support to your memorial, I became a threat. Because I know how their system works. I know where the bodies are buried. And they know that if I start talking, their whole empire comes crashing down." Margaret's eyes widened. "So the fraud allegations against you? Fabricated. Planted by Meridian's people in the media. They're trying to discredit me before I can expose them." Victor reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. Small, black, unremarkable. "But they made a mistake. They thought their files were secure. They thought no one would ever find the real records. He held up the flash drive. This contains everything. Bank transfers, names, dates. Enough evidence to bring down Franklin Tate and everyone he works with. The room went silent. David Morrison stared at the flash drive like it was a grenade. Lily's face had gone pale. Margaret looked at Victor with new eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk everything for this? For a memorial you didn't even believe in 2 weeks ago?" Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Stripped of arrogance. Stripped of performance. "Because I spent 30 years becoming everything my father hated," he said. "I told myself I was building wealth, building power, building security. But all I was really building was a wall between myself and everyone who might actually matter." He looked at Margaret. "Your husband spent 40 years saving money to build something beautiful for strangers. I spent 40 years hoarding money to build nothing but my own ego. When I saw that number on the screen in the bank, $25 million, saved by a man who never told anyone, intended for people he would never meet, I realized something." He paused. "I realized I was the poor one. Not you." Margaret's eyes glistened. "So what do we do now?" Lily asked. "How do we fight them?" Victor stood up. "Tomorrow morning, there's a city council meeting. Open session. Anyone can speak during public comments." He held out the flash drive. "I'm going to walk in there and expose everything. Names, numbers, the whole operation. By the time I'm done, Meridian Development won't be able to build a doghouse in this city, let alone a water treatment plant." David Morrison stepped forward. "That's dangerous. These people have already shown they're willing to use violence." "I know." Victor's voice was calm. "That's why I'm not asking any of you to come with me. This is my fight. I dragged you into it, and I'll drag you out." Margaret stood up from her chair. Slowly, painfully, with the weight of 75 years pressing down on her bones. She walked to Victor. And she took his hand. "Mr. Matthews," she said, "my husband carried 17 men through enemy fire because he believed no soldier should die alone. I'm not about to let you walk into that council meeting by yourself." Victor looked down at her. For a moment, his composure cracked. Just for a moment. "Mrs. Hayes." "Margaret," she corrected. "If we're going to war together, you should call me Margaret." Lily stepped forward. "I'm coming too." David Morrison nodded. "Count me in." Victor looked at the three of them, a 75-year-old widow, a corporate lawyer, and a banker with an army pin on his lapel. His army. "All right," he said. "Then tomorrow we fight." But none of them knew that Franklin Tate was watching. That Meridian's people were already planning their next move. And that the city council meeting would become a battlefield unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The council chamber was packed. Every seat filled. People standing along the walls. Reporters with cameras. Citizens with signs. The story had exploded overnight: the widow, the millionaire, the allegations, the corruption. Everyone wanted to see how it would end. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating steady and strong. Lily was beside her, legal pad ready, eyes sharp. David Morrison flanked her other side, his veteran's pin catching the light. Victor stood near the podium, waiting for his turn to speak. He had cleaned up overnight, fresh suit, fresh shave, the cut above his eye now covered with a small bandage. But his eyes told a different story. The eyes of a man who knew he might not walk out of this room the same way he walked in. Franklin Tate sat across the aisle, surrounded by lawyers and Meridian executives. His face was calm, confident, the face of a man who had already won and was just waiting for everyone else to realize it. The council chairman, a woman named Patricia Vance, called the meeting to order. "We have several items on today's agenda," she announced. "But given the public interest, we'll begin with open comments regarding the Riverside Development Project." She looked at the crowd. "Who would like to speak first?" Victor stepped forward. "Victor Matthews. I'd like to address the council." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Franklin Tate's smile flickered. Victor walked to the podium. He placed the flash drive on the wooden surface in front of him. "Such a small thing," Such an enormous bomb. Council members, he began, I'm here today to present evidence of systematic fraud, corruption, and criminal conspiracy involving Meridian Development and certain public officials in this city. The murmur became a roar. Patricia Vance banged her gavel. Order! Order in the chamber! Franklin Tate stood up. Madam Chairman, this is outrageous. Mr. Matthews is currently under investigation for fraud himself. His testimony should not be. Those allegations are false. Victor cut in. Fabricated by Meridian to discredit me before I could expose the truth. And I have proof. He held up the flash drive. On this drive are financial records showing how Meridian Development has laundered over $300 million through fake construction projects over the past decade. Shell companies. Inflated contracts. Kickbacks to city officials who approved permits that should never have been granted. He turned to face Franklin Tate directly, including the emergency eminent domain seizure of Margaret Hayes's property. A seizure that was illegal, rushed through in a closed session without proper notice, specifically to prevent a veterans memorial from being built on land Meridian wanted for their money laundering operation. The chamber exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Citizens jumped to their feet. Council members exchanged panicked glances. Patricia Vance hammered her gavel again and again, but no one was listening. Franklin Tate's face had gone white. This is slander, he shouted over the noise. This is a desperate attempt by a disgraced man to. It's not slander if it's true. Victor's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. And I have the receipts. He turned to the council. I'm submitting this evidence to the State Attorney General's office as we speak. My lawyers are filing injunctions to halt all Meridian construction projects, pending investigation. And I'm requesting that this council immediately reverse the illegal seizure of Margaret Hayes's land and restore her rightful ownership. Patricia Vance stared at the flash drive like it might bite her. Mr. Matthews, these are serious allegations. We'll need time to. You've had time. Victor's voice hardened. 10 years of time, while Meridian bought and sold this city's integrity. Time is over. Now you choose. Do the right thing, or become part of the investigation yourself. The chamber went silent. Every eye was on Patricia Vance. She looked at Franklin Tate, at Victor, at the flash drive sitting on the podium. Then she looked at Margaret Hayes, an old woman in a simple dress, sitting in the front row, waiting to find out if her husband's dream would live or die. Patricia Vance closed her eyes. The council will take a 30-minute recess to review Mr. Matthews's evidence. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Franklin Tate. Mr. Tate, I suggest you contact your lawyer. You're going to need one. She banged her gavel. The chamber erupted again. But Margaret wasn't listening to the noise. She was watching Franklin Tate's face as the reality sank in. The color draining. The confidence crumbling. The empire he had built beginning to collapse around him. Lily grabbed her grandmother's hand. Grandma, I think we might actually win this. Margaret squeezed back. Not yet, sweetheart. Not yet. Because she had seen something in Franklin Tate's eyes as he pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Not defeat. Rage. The kind of rage that makes men do desperate things. And Margaret Hayes had learned a long time ago that desperate men are the most dangerous kind. The recess had barely begun when the fire alarm went off. Smoke poured through the council chamber. Not real fire, Margaret could tell that immediately. The smoke was too white, too chemical. Smoke bombs. Diversions. But the panic was real. People screaming, shoving, trampling each other to reach the exits. Margaret lost sight of Lily in the chaos. Lily, she shouted. Lily! Someone grabbed her arm. David Morrison, his face tight with military focus. This way, he said. Stay close to me. He pulled her toward a side door, away from the stampede. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Victor, she gasped. Where's Victor? I don't know. Keep moving. They burst through the side door into a hallway. Emergency lights flashed red. The smoke was thinner here, but the alarm still screamed overhead. David pulled out his phone. Tried to call Lily. No signal. They're jamming communications, he said grimly. This isn't random. This is a coordinated attack. Margaret's blood ran cold. Franklin Tate. Has to be. He's destroying evidence, creating chaos, buying time to disappear. David looked down the hallway. We need to find Victor. If Tate's people get to him first. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They moved down the hallway, past locked offices and emergency exits. The smoke was clearing now, but the chaos continued. Security guards ran past them, shouting into radios that crackled with static. They rounded a corner and stopped. Victor Matthews was on his knees in the middle of the hallway. Blood dripped from a fresh cut on his temple. Two men in black suits stood over him, the same men who had given him the first cut, Margaret realized. Tate's enforcers. One of them held a gun. The flash drive, the man with the gun said. Where is it? Victor looked up. His face was battered, but his eyes were defiant. Gone, he said. Already uploaded. Already sent. You're too late. The man with the gun raised it toward Victor's head. Then you're no longer useful. Margaret didn't think. She stepped forward. Stop. The men turned. Saw an old woman in a navy dress walking toward them like she had nothing to fear. Mrs. Hayes. The gunman almost laughed. What are you going to do? Hit me with your purse? Margaret kept walking. Closer. Closer. I'm going to give you one chance, she said. One chance to walk away. To tell Franklin Tate that this is over. That no amount of money, no amount of power, is worth what you're about to do. The gunman shook his head. Lady, you've got about 5 seconds to. My husband saved 17 men in Vietnam. The word stopped him. Margaret was close now. Close enough to see the sweat on his forehead. Close enough to see the doubt flickering in his eyes. He carried them through fire and blood and death because he believed that every life matters. Every single one. Her voice didn't waver. And I've spent the last 50 years honoring that belief. Teaching children. Helping neighbors. Building something beautiful in his memory. She took one more step. You can pull that trigger. You can kill us both. But it won't change anything. The evidence is already out. The truth is already free. All you'll do is add murder to your list of crimes. She looked directly into his eyes. Is that who you want to be? Is that what you want your mother to read about in the newspaper? The gunman's hand trembled. Behind her, David Morrison was slowly reaching for something in his jacket. Margaret didn't know what. She didn't turn to look. She kept her eyes locked on the man with the gun. You have a choice, she said softly. Right now. In this moment. You can choose to be the kind of man who destroys. Or you can choose to be the kind of man who walks away. Silence. The alarm kept screaming. The emergency lights kept flashing. The gunman lowered his weapon. Tate doesn't pay me enough for this, he muttered. He turned and walked away. His partner hesitated, then followed. Victor collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Margaret knelt beside him. Her knees screamed in protest, but she didn't care. Mr. Matthews. Victor. Are you all right? Victor looked up at her. Blood on his face. Tears in his eyes. You just. He shook his head. You just talked down a man with a gun. I've handled worse, Margaret said. I taught 7th grade for 38 years. Despite everything, Victor laughed. A broken, beautiful sound. David Morrison helped them both to their feet. We need to move. Police are coming. This whole building is about to become a crime scene. They made their way toward the exit. Toward the light. Toward whatever came next. And as they stepped outside into the afternoon sun, Margaret saw something that made her heart stop. Lily was standing on the front steps of City Hall. Unharmed. And beside her, in handcuffs, was Franklin Tate. Police cars surrounded the building. FBI agents moved through the crowd. News helicopters circled overhead. Lily ran to her grandmother and threw her arms around her. They got him, she whispered. They got all of them. The evidence Victor uploaded went straight to the FBI. They've been building a case for months. They just needed the final piece. Margaret held her granddaughter tight. Tighter than she had in years. Over Lily's shoulder, She watched Franklin Tate being loaded into a federal vehicle. His face was blank, empty. The face of a man who had just lost everything. Victor limped toward them, supported by David Morrison. "It's over," he said. "It's really over." Margaret looked at the man who had laughed at her in a bank lobby 2 weeks ago. The man who had become an ally, then a friend, then something like family. "No," she said softly. "It's not over yet." She turned toward the riverside. Toward the land that was once again hers. "Now we build." 1 year later, the sun rose over the Thomas Hayes Memorial Park, painting the water gold and copper and rose. Margaret stood at the edge of the reflecting pool, watching the light spread across the granite wall where 3,000 names were carved. Sons and daughters. Husbands and wives. Brothers and sisters. All of them gone too soon. All of them remembered forever. The bronze sculpture towered behind her, a soldier kneeling, one hand reaching toward the sky, the other pressed against his heart. The artist had captured something in the pose that made people stop and stare. Gratitude. All of it, frozen in metal, waiting for anyone who needed to find it. Lily walked up beside her grandmother. She was wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes red from crying she thought she had hidden. "The crowd is huge," she said. "Must be 1,000 people out there. More will come." Margaret's voice was soft. "They always do." David Morrison approached from the main pathway, straightening his tie. His veteran's pin gleamed in the morning light. "News crews are set up. Governor's motorcade just arrived. And Victor is asking if you're ready." Margaret turned to face the crowd gathered behind the barriers. Veterans in wheelchairs. Families holding photographs. Children too young to understand why their parents were crying. All of them waiting to witness the moment Thomas Hayes's dream became real. "I'm ready," she said. She walked toward the main stage, where a podium had been set up in front of the memorial wall. Victor Matthews stood to the side, looking healthier than he had a year ago. The scars had healed. The shadows under his eyes had faded. He had spent the last 12 months rebuilding his reputation, testifying against Meridian executives, and quietly donating millions to veterans' causes across the country. He caught Margaret's eye and nodded. She nodded back. Then she climbed the steps to the podium. The crowd fell silent. Margaret looked out at the sea of faces. Old and young. Rich and poor. Strangers united by grief, by gratitude, by the simple need to remember. "Good morning," she said, her voice carried by the microphone across the park. "Thank you all for being here." She paused, gathered herself. 55 years ago, a young man from Ohio enlisted in the United States Army. He was 18 years old. He had never been more than 50 miles from the town where he was born. He didn't know what war looked like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like. But he knew one thing. She gripped the podium. He knew that service meant something. That some things are worth fighting for. That the people standing beside you, your brothers, your sisters, deserve everything you have to give. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. His name was Thomas Hayes. "He was my husband for 43 years. He saved 17 lives during an ambush that took 43 others. He came home with medals he refused to wear and nightmares he never talked about. He worked a factory job for 4 decades, raised a daughter, loved a granddaughter, and quietly, without anyone knowing, built a fortune he never intended to spend on himself." She turned to look at the memorial wall. "Thomas asked me for one thing before he died. He asked me to build something beautiful. Something that would stand for 100 years. Something that would tell the world, we were here. We mattered. We served." She turned back to the crowd. "This memorial is that promise fulfilled. Not just my promise to Thomas, but America's promise to every man and woman who has worn the uniform. The promise that we will never forget. That we will honor their sacrifice. That we will teach our children what courage looks like." She stepped back from the podium. "I'd like to introduce someone who helped make this possible. A man who started as a stranger, became an ally, and is now family. Victor Matthews." Victor climbed the steps to polite applause that grew stronger as he reached the podium. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the crowd, at the memorial, at the old woman who had changed his life. "A year ago," he said, "I walked into a bank and laughed at a woman checking her balance. I thought I knew everything about money, about power, about what makes a person rich." He shook his head. "I was wrong. About all of it." He gestured toward Margaret. "This woman taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the lives you touch, the promises you keep, the legacy you leave behind." He looked at the memorial wall. 3,000 names are carved into that granite. 3,000 stories cut short. 3,000 families who said goodbye and never got to say hello again. This memorial exists because one man loved his country, one woman kept her promise, and a whole community decided that some things are worth fighting for. He turned back to the crowd. "If you're listening to this story right now, I want you to remember something. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how much power you hold. What matters is what you do with the time you're given." He stepped back. "Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you for showing me what real wealth looks like." The applause washed over the park like a wave. Margaret walked to Victor's side. They stood together, looking out at the crowd, at the memorial, at the future they had built from ruins. Lily joined them. Then David Morrison. Then others, veterans, volunteers, strangers who had become friends during the long year of construction and controversy and hope. The governor stepped forward to cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered. And somewhere, Margaret could swear she heard Thomas's voice on the wind. "Well done, Maggie. Well done." The dedication ceremony lasted 3 hours. Speeches and songs and moments of silence. Veterans traced names on the wall with trembling fingers. Children placed flowers at the base of the bronze sculpture. Families hugged strangers and strangers became family. As the sun began to set, Margaret found herself alone by the reflecting pool. The crowds had thinned. The news crews had packed up. The quiet had returned. Lily appeared at her side. "How do you feel, Grandma?" Margaret smiled. A real smile. The kind that comes from somewhere deep inside. "I feel like I finally kept my promise." Lily put her arm around her grandmother's shoulders. They stood together, watching the last light of day dance across the water. "What happens now?" Lily asked. Margaret thought about the question. About the future stretching out before them. About all the work still to be done, the scholarships to fund, the programs to build, the stories to tell. "Now," she said, "we make sure it was all worth something. We help the next generation understand what sacrifice means. We teach them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing the right thing even when you're terrified." She turned to face her granddaughter. "And we live, sweetheart. We live every day like it matters. Because it does." Lily hugged her grandmother tight. And as the stars began to emerge over the Thomas Hayes Memorial Park, Margaret Hayes closed her eyes and whispered a final message to the man she had loved for more than half a century. "We did it, Thomas. We built something beautiful." The wind carried her words across the water. And somewhere, in the place where heroes rest, a soldier smiled. This concludes the story of Margaret Hayes, the widow who walked into a bank to check her balance and ended up building a legacy that will last forever. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the sacrifices of those who serve, if it reminded you that true wealth has nothing to do with the numbers in your bank account, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this deserve to be told. Stories of courage, of sacrifice, of love that outlasts death. Stories that remind us what really matters. And if you have a story of your own, a veteran in your family, a sacrifice that deserves to be remembered, a moment when someone showed you what true wealth looks like, share it in the comments. Let's build a community that honors those who gave everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping prove that these tales matter. Until next time, take care of each other. Hold your loved ones close. And never forget that the greatest legacy you can leave is a life lived with purpose. This is True Guardian Tales. And we'll see you in the next story.